Welcome to the virtual McMaster Museum of Art. My name is Carol Pottedwarney, and I am the Director and Chief Curator at the museum. We are pleased that you have chosen to join us for the Immune Nations webinar series. As we gather, we are reminded that the museum is situated on land that is the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee and Mississauga peoples. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening this community. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet here and reaffirm our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our community. You may have noticed that we have sign language interpretation available for this webinar. So before we begin, I would like to introduce two ASL interpreters here with us today, Diane Diendrade and Erin Eldridge. Thank you, Erin and Diane, for being here. The Immune Nations exhibition is co-led by Natalie Lovelace with Stephen Hoffman and Sean Caulfield. The exhibition explores complex issues related to the use and distribution of vaccines in the world today and the capacity of artistic research to solicit complex forms of effective engagement when dealing with difficult and diverse social and political topics such as vaccination. Today's panel explores the value of research creation and a recognized authenticated role for art to play in addressing global issues, such as vaccination. Foregrounded in this conversation is the status of art as a legitimate form of research and dissemination. In terms of exhibition programming, there are a total of 3 panels in our webinar series, this being the second in the series, with the third and final panel on December 9th, titled Vaccine Confidence, Fear and Misinformation in an Age of COVID. A panel exploring the impact of misinformation on vaccination, as well as ways of countering the negative impacts of misinformation in relation to public health. For your information, all of the panels will be under the same format and occur at the same time on different dates. And all of the panels have been supported significantly by a grant from the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. In terms of housekeeping for today's panel and the subsequent panel, we will have a 45-minute roundtable discussion, then a 30-minute open chat or Q&A, and a brief closing provided by Natalie Lovelace. Please load your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You can load them throughout the event, and they will be brought to Natalie either individually or grouped thematically, and she will bring them to the panel for response. So, I would like to welcome our visitors, and I would like to welcome Natalie, the curator of the exhibition and a professor at the University of Alberta. I will hand it over to her to introduce the panelists and start our panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol, for that introduction. Everyone can hear me, right? Yes, good. I want to take a moment and also thank you, Carol, and all the staff who made this exhibition and series of panels possible. It's been a really, truly wonderful experience. So thank you so much for all of the hard work and camaraderie and collaboration around putting it together under these COVID conditions. As Carol mentioned, my name is Natalie Lovelace. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a light-skinned woman in a black shirt and black cardigan with shoulder-length curly brown hair and bangs, wearing black and gold-rimmed glasses and an orange scarf. I'm also a professor of contemporary art and theory at the University of Alberta, here where I'm sitting right now in Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwitsi-Waskagan, which translates to Beaver Hills House and is the Cree name for this place we call Edmonton in English. And while I originally hail from Tiohtià:ke or Montreal, this is where I've been living and working and learning for almost a decade now. We are here distributed in all of the ways that we are. And I'm really excited to present this panel, which is the second, as Carol mentioned, of a 3-part series. And if you, I would put it into the chat, but we don't have a normal Zoom chat function. But if you go to www.uninations.com, under the events, all 3 are there and you can register for the next one, which is December 9th. And as you can see, we also have ASL interpretation. And so I am going to do my best not to speak too quickly. And it's one of the things that happens when I get excited or moved by a topic. So I'll do my best not to speak too quickly so as to facilitate this, the interpretation. But Diane, Aaron, please jump in if I fail in that endeavor, okay? We're gonna start off with a moderated roundtable conversation. And so I'm going to start off by saying a little bit about I'm going to introduce panelists, say a little bit about the context for this panel, and then offer a few questions to start the ball rolling. But I encourage all of our panelists to jump in and take this really as a authentic and robust conversation. So jump in at any time. And for all of you who are here in the audience, please do put in questions into the chat throughout, either to all of us or to individuals, and I'm going to fold these all in at the end. Okay, so with that said, let me introduce our panelists. First, I'm going to direct you to Caitlin Fisher and Patrick Mann. I don't know if you want to kind of wave Patrick and Caitlin. These are 2 artists on the panel who were part of the Immunations exhibition. Caitlin directs both the Immersive Storytelling Lab at CineSpace Studios and the Augmented Reality Lab at York University in Toronto, where for 10 years she held the Canada Research Chair in Digital Culture. She's a co-founder of York's Future Cinema Lab and a 2013 Fulbright Research Chair. And she's also the recipient of many international awards for digital storytelling. She serves on the International Executive Board of the Humanities, Arts, Science, and Advanced Collaboratory. Let me pause for a moment so that can be signed, also known as HASTAC. And she is the Vice President of the Electronic Literature Association. Thanks. Patrick Mann is a distinguished university professor in the Visual Arts Department at Western University and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Mann's artwork has been exhibited and collected widely in Canada and internationally. In Canada, at the Art Gallery of Hamilton, at the Southern Alberta Art Gallery, at Museum London, the Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art in Toronto, and the Winnipeg Art Gallery. And he's been shown internationally in exhibitions in China, France, Norway, Switzerland, and in numerous print biennials since the early 1990s. And now also joining us are doctors Kim TallBear, Ted Hewitt, and Geneviève Boily-Larouche. Dr. TallBear is Professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Society in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. She is the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science, and the co-founder of the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, or SING. In addition to studying the politics of the biological sciences and their implications for Indigenous peoples, Dr. TallBear studies colonial disruptions to Indigenous sexualities. Dr. Ted Hewitt is the president of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, or SSHRC, a role to which he was appointed in March 2015. He served as the inaugural chair of the Canada Research Coordinating Committee from 2017 to 2019, and before that served as Vice President, Research and International Relations at Western University in London, Ontario. He did that from 2004 to 2011, where he had been a professor of sociology since 1989. And last but not least, Dr. Geneviève Boily-Larouche is the Assistant Scientific Director of the CIHR, Canadian Institutes for Health Research, Institute of Infection and Immunity, This institute provides scientific leadership in Canada and supports research in the areas of infectious disease and the body's immune system through a broad portfolio of funding programs and capacity building initiatives. Prior to joining CIHR in that capacity, Dr. Boily-Larouche worked at the National Collaborating Center for Infectious Diseases, where she led the HIV and sexually transmitted and blood-borne infections portfolio. Thank you all for being here. We have an amazing group of people. Thanks in advance for joining this discussion, and again, for taking time out of your busy schedules. I want to start the discussion, or frame the discussion, by saying a little bit about the methodology that went into the Immunations exhibition, which was really the brainchild of Stephen Hoffman, who moderated the first panel in the series and is a professor of global health, law, and political science at York University. He's also the director of the Global Strategy Lab and the scientific director of the CIHR Institute of Population and Public Health. So a really interesting, committed, visionary worker, interested in the capacity of research creation to contribute to and partner with public health discourse. So the project was co-led by Stephen, together with myself and Sean Caulfield, who's an internationally renowned printmaker and former Centennial professor in the Department of Art and Design here, where we both teach at the University of Alberta. We started this project in 2014, so well before COVID, and we started it primarily as a methodological experiment. We're asking, how can we develop a truly interdisciplinary and collaborative project on the topic of vaccines? And what this meant for us was setting up conditions to bring artists and scientists and policy experts together to address a pressing global problem that we couldn't even have predicted, right, in terms of our experience of it today. So bring these folks together to address this in a way that would resist commonplace additive interdisciplinary practices, right? So that would resist those ways of doing interdisciplinarity across the arts and the sciences that have the scientist and the policymaker bringing the data, and the artist doing the interpretive, illustrative, and outreach work. So that was a paradigm, a model of collaboration and interdisciplinarity that we wanted to seriously resist. It's not that some of that didn't happen, right? We each, after all, have different areas of expertise, but what we wanted, more than simply a skill exchange, what we wanted was to bring folks together in ways that would ask all of us to reinvestigate the very bases of our own methods and approaches through the lenses of each other's. So the wager here was that taking the time to learn about each other and to learn each other's disciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches, each other's understandings, each other's biases, each other's concerns, that taking that time and through taking the time to do that kind of thinking with the other, also using that to re-examine our own presumptions, that doing that work would work first and foremost to create a community, and then from there, facilitate different conditions for production and more interesting, meaningful, robust interdisciplinary outputs. So there were two things that we knew were necessary in order to do this. The first thing is time, right? It takes time to do that work of not only learning another's approach, but reinvestigating one's own, right? So we were really lucky to have that time, the first few years where we really didn't have to be organized around outputs and production. So that was one thing that was necessary. The other thing that was necessary, and it doesn't get spoken about enough to my mind, is the generosity of spirit that was needed to keep on going in conversations where at one point or another, everyone felt their disciplinary worldview being misunderstood. So in that sense, the collaboration was emergent, not always easy, and the interdisciplinarity genuine. In that regard, the project is also really interesting as an experiment in research creation. So research creation, as many of you sitting here well know, is an interdisciplinary practice. It's an interdisciplinary practice in which art is not mobilized as a reflective or an illustrative or an expressive object, or not solely as these, but is understood as a set of skills and a set of literacies in artistic technique, combined with a keen capacity to think through aesthetic form. Like if you think of Shirk's definition, right, it's a very clear definition of research creation that Shirk offers. They call it an approach to research that combines creative and academic research practices. So it's combinatory, and that supports the development of knowledge and innovation through artistic expression, scholarly investigation, and experimentations, all of these. So if we take this combinatory or interdisciplinary core of this definition to heart, research creation projects like Immunations insist that artistic literacies are recognized in their difference, yet held with equal value and weight within university research spaces and programs. Right? That really is the productive core of research creation to my mind. In other words, the research creation project is not add artists and stir, but to ask what artistic methods and literacies might offer the project of remaking our siloed academic and social worlds. So with that said, I want to turn to Caitlin and Patrick to start the ball rolling. And what I'd like to do is invite you to speak to your experience throughout the core years of the Immunations project. And I'm particularly interested in having you address or speak to the methodological approach that we developed, both in terms of the specific works that you developed and the project as a whole.
So thanks very much, Natalie. I think I'm going to go first. First of all, I want to just greet my fellow panelists and say it's an honor to join you today. I'll also just acknowledge that I'm a light-skinned man, and I'm a little bit of an older professor, and very happy to be talking from what's called London, Ontario. It's at the forks of, in the traditional Indigenous language here, it's called the Deshkan-Zibing, the river, and it's also called the Thames River. So I'm happy to be here. I'm going to, Natalie, first of all, just address more broadly your question about what we've learned and experienced regarding immunations and thinking about interdisciplinarity and methodology. And then I'll talk a little bit specifically about how Annemarie, who was in charge of communications and then human resources at UNAIDS when we were working on the project. She and I worked on a project entitled Design for a Dissemunization Station. And dissemunization is a made-up word. So what I want to do to talk about interdisciplinarity and methodology is to say that I think that there are experiences many of us have had in the university with interdisciplinarity that are quite similar. But I've had some experiences around methodology from supervising PhD art students that I think are somewhat particular, and they do kind of parallel some of the things that we encountered in working on our project. I think one of the things that we encounter when we're working with interdisciplinarity is what we all know as disciplinary expertise. You know, those things that are really our strengths and what we hold dear in our respective fields. And so I think dealing with both an understanding of those things and some kind of openness in that regard requires some creative negotiations. And by the same token, I also think that we encounter a kind of reticence about the disciplinary expertise of the other discipline. And, you know, as an artist, I often work with people who say, I don't know anything about art. And I similarly have to admit how little I know about the areas that they may be working in the sciences, etc. So I think some of the challenges that we face and the way that we might actually sort of negotiate them are as follows. One is that we need to find analogies between our discipline-specific approaches. Another is that I think we need to respectfully recognize those things that the other researcher might hold dear that we might better not kind of touch. And that may have to do with, in my case, some of the kind of material making, but maybe not. Maybe I want my collaborator to pick up a paintbrush or a camera. And thirdly, I think we have to keep recognizing that interdisciplinarity is a research and creative conversation. And the conversation piece, I think, was quite important with immune nations. Just to say a little wee bit about my working with PhD art students that I think has some analogies in my experience with immune nations. I think that sometimes in areas that are more established at the PhD level, there may be a set of recognized methodologies from which students will, we could say, choose and adapt. But I think that in doing a PhD in art, fundamentally, it's a new field, and there really isn't a recognized list of methodologies from which a student will choose, as it were. So I think students at the PhD level need to evolve a methodology. They need to find some comparators and analogies in other disciplinary areas. And then they have to find some language and creative approaches for articulating the methodology as part of the outcomes of the project. And I do think that those are things that we really did with immune nations. We found a way to have an interdisciplinary conversation, and we also found a way to express the method of the work within the exhibition. Now I'm going to share my screen and just show you a couple of images of the project that I did with Annemarie. So this is called Design for a Disseminization Station. And I will describe the project. I would say that in general, it's really a speculative design project that imagines ways and contexts for distributing vaccines and also for disseminating information about vaccines. So the project, and this is Annemarie Hu with me at the UN AIDS building in Geneva. So this was the second iteration of the presentation. The project is made of 2 portable tents, and they do fold down and fit into little bags that are decorated with watercolor images of models of vaccine adjuvants, which is scientists will understand better than I what an adjuvant does. And ultimately, these images appear as quite decorative on the surface of those tents. And the tents, and in fact, I was thinking more recently that I think the decorative quality really is probably a little less threatening than the kinds of graphics we've been seeing on TV, for example, during our COVID pandemic. Within the tents, there are what we would call listening stations. And in some of the earlier iterations, people were allowed to put on headphones and listen to recordings, radio recordings of reports of epidemics and also related to vaccination from really the 20th century and early 21st century. And also in the background of the piece, there is a kind of soundscape which is meant to suggest the movement of a vaccine through the body. And clearly this is a very sort of fanciful kind of expression. Earlier with the presentation of this work, we had interviews with public health and art students about the challenge of storytelling as a form of public engagement. But we did leave it out in the exhibition at McMaster because it already felt dated in times of COVID. So I'll just say something about our methodology, and then I will wrap it up with a couple more slides just to say something else about some projects I've done very quickly. I think with the methodology that Annemarie and I evolved, we had to actually recognize some givens. One was that Annemarie has tremendous expertise in communication of information and in media storytelling, so we wanted to use that. I have strengths as what I would call a purveyor of compelling visual and material experiences through aesthetic expressions. And we both had a mutual interest and understanding in design, broadly construed, and in attempting to invite audiences and members of the public into thinking about how systems work, including systems of distribution. So you could say that, in a sense, there was a kind of meta aspect of our methodology that we made available to people looking at the work. And these are suggested kind of uses for this tent that people are allowed to kind of, are encouraged to kind of speculate on. I guess the last thing I would say regarding our project is when you look at it, you might think that in times of a COVID pandemic, it's a rather fanciful kind of art project. But I want to argue that I think that we have seen what I would call real ugliness expressed in relation to the efforts of people, the honest and skilled efforts of people, healthcare people, to keep us well and safe. And so I honestly think that the suspension of beauty and even expressions that involve nuance at this time in history, actually, I think that's not an option. I think art has a job to do in that regard. So before I turn it over to Caitlin, I'm just going to show 3 quick slides. And these are just other projects that I have done over the years in collaboration with artists and people in communities. This one involved looking at the simultaneous introduction of Western notions of art practice and a money economy into Northern Canada, very much a colonial project, working with people, Inuit artists and others who had lived in Northern Canada. The second project focuses on water and globalization, and also involved a very interdisciplinary group. And this third project is a project that's currently taking place as an exhibition at Museum London that I co-curated with the Indigenous curator and photographer Jeff Thomas, and really looks at the simultaneous challenges of the environmental crisis and the need to decolonize. So I will leave it at that. That's just to give you a picture of other works that I've been involved in case we need to talk about those. So I'll stop sharing and mute. Thank you.
Oh, that was wonderful, Patrick. Thank you so much for that. I am a light-skinned woman with curly brown hair, currently speaking to you from Paris. Delighted to be here and to revisit this amazing project. I think because Patrick provided such a fulsome analysis of some of the ways we were working, I'm going to try to come at it a little bit sideways and take up your comment, Natalie, about time and generosity. I came into the project having been involved in a number of interdisciplinary, even research creation collaborations, often with NSERC colleagues. When I came into this project that brought together artists and policymakers and people interested in vaccines, I really felt out of my element. It was extremely difficult in the initial moment for me to imagine how this would be anything but art in the service of data-driven requirements. I was one of the participants who came in a little bit concerned that the art would be incredibly didactic. And at the moment, pre-COVID, also thinking, well, how urgent is it to think about vaccines? So fast forward, the urgency has become incredibly apparent to us. But also, I want to stress how the experience has actually, when you come into a multi-year project like this, working across disciplines, working across ways of knowing, the most exciting thing is that your practice will be changed. And so for that reason, I really want to focus on your idea that this takes time, Natalie, because in the beginning, I think it's so easy to continue to work the ways we're working. And it's easy to imagine that we just need better listening. The more radical transformation is sort of that alchemy of understanding that having discussed the way you work, the way you want to experiment, and different levels of risk in our team. So I was incredibly fortunate to work both with Stephen Hoffman, who has been introduced here, and also with one of my brilliant doctoral students, Alison Humphrey, who led our project called Shadowpox. Stephen, as we've already discussed, comes from his enormous expertise in global health. Alison Humphrey is in the doctoral program in cinema and media arts at York University, but has a very fulsome background in both interactive media and theater. When we began to work together, I realized that there was this beautiful relation of tolerance to risk, of being able to reimagine my practice while having because of Stephen's openness and his incredible intellectual breadth and generosity, I was able to see into the kind of data that would be possible and no longer felt in service of this data. What I felt was that it was radically going to reactivate my practice. And the questions of how art makes sense in terms of activating the imaginations of people to perhaps engage in different kinds of public health behaviors, how art can change the way people people see things, obviously, but also how people might behave. This is something that had been entirely outside of my repertoire. The idea that I ever wanted to be making art that would be about shifting behavior. And as a consequence of this project, the power of art to do that has become part of what I've been very, very interested to do. There are subsequent projects that I've been very interested in and working with CIHR researchers. One of the, I think I'll show a little slide of my project, just bear with me one moment, so you can have a sense of what we did. So our project was called Shadowpox. And if you're seeing my screen now, it proposes a future fiction scenario where there is an imagined health threat called Shadowpox. And it proposes sort of a threshold moment where you enter an interactive space and decide whether to be immunized or whether to not be immunized. And you can then find out whether or not, so the little people there are represent sort of your population of 100. And based on data that you can select based on country, and a number of different ways that the data was modeled, vaccine penetration, money spent on public health, and based on real world data from an actual pandemic, that you can find out your level of infection, the likelihood that you will be infected, and the likelihood that you will infect others and potentially harm them. And then following this interactive moment, you can also then find out your collection of stories of the people who you either help to keep safe as a consequence of vaccination, or the people who might have become ill or even died as a consequence of your choices. So it involves sort of speculative moment, fiction. It mobilizes data. It thinks about mathematical modeling in interesting ways, and it is fundamentally a project that none of us would have come up with on our own. And it is a project that also came up that involved many iterations. And just very, very grateful for the opportunity about what it enabled me to think, the new methods that it gave me that I will bring into the future, the opportunity to be led by, I think, a new generation of people at the forefront of research creation. Alison will be defending this year, and I think will, brings this research creation practice to all of her work and what she'll be doing next. So I think I'm going to stop there. I think at a later point, I would love to speak a little bit about how this was different than some of my my collaborative work with NSERC colleagues. I'll just sort of signal, though, that I have had many projects, particularly with engineers and computer science and vision scientists. directing the Augmented Reality Lab, and that those have also been incredibly important to my work. And my work would never, I don't think my work can ever go backwards, having had these important interdisciplinary collaborations that have involved making and breaking things and experimentation and trust and making something new. And I hope that my collaborators feel sort of similarly changed.
Thank you, Caitlin. Can you unshare your screen? And I'm going to invite Elise. Can you pin Kim and bring Kim onto the floor? I'd like to invite Kim into the conversation, and keep Caitlin, keep Patrick. So first of all, one of the things that I really kind of was drawn to in what both of you were sharing is like Patrick, you placed it, you framed it as a kind of analogic thinking, a requirement to, and also a requirement of respect for divergent perspectives, something that Chantal Mouffe might call an agonistic, or Dylan Robinson might call an apposite methodology, and kind of the importance of that in our experience of the project, right? And how that necessitated the gift of time and the willingness to stay in the conversations that, as we've pointed to, sometimes became quite difficult. The other thing that you are underscoring is the way that I was framing the interdisciplinarity, or the emergent methodology of the project. And Patrick, you mentioned that in terms of what it means to train research creation graduate students. And while it's not a new project, it is relatively new on the kind of, in the university time scale. And, and it's one of the reasons that I am continually drawn to articulating research creation in terms of interdisciplinary method, has to do with the requirement of an interdisciplinary approach to really undo the the givenness of disciplinary method when you come into work as a graduate student or come to work in and around the academy. And Kim, as my littermate in terms of our doctoral training, Kim and I both went to a doctoral program that was understood itself as non-disciplinary. So the methods course at the beginning of the doctoral training was called Approaches. And the idea was to develop, at least in my experience, to develop a robust capacity to both speak across not only disciplinary difference, but also across kind of sets of differences in political commitment, and really have the methods, the literatures that we would need for our doctoral work emerge almost as a back formation of the research question or node of curiosity that had driven us to grad school. And so there really was a kind of overturning of the linearity of many disciplinary university practices that I think speaks really strongly to the promises and possibilities of research creation in the academy and around the academy. So Kim, I would love at this point to invite you into the conversation to share a bit about the projects that you've been involved in and say a bit about how you navigate and mobilize research creation, which I know is something that you came to after coming to Canada. So how you mobilize it and work with it in your larger research programs. A program that is devoted to social and ecological justice, and all of you do this in fact. And also, I'm not thinking only of your research projects, but I've kind of seen you on the ground in terms of the advocacy and mentorship that you do in classrooms and with students. So I wonder if you could kind of step in and speak to some of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much I'd want to say. And also that I'm not at the center of research creation, like I don't have all the language you all have. And it's been my graduate students in the Faculty of Native Studies that are they're really the true, I think, groundbreaking theorists in this area for us, right? And they should probably be here. But I like the way you talked about our grad program as being it is problem centered. That's the way I think of it. You go with a problem and then you gather the tools to attack that problem, right? And you're right. I think that is the way that we are sort of bringing research creation more broadly into the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. I mean, my work has largely been critiques of science and technology, particularly genetic science, and its kind of colonial approaches to studying Indigenous bodies, bones, blood, etc. And then how to see that articulate with our performance work has been fascinating. So I have two labs, like your collaboratory kind of, right? I've got one that's focused on Indigenous science, technology, and society, where people are actually doing sociology and anthropology of science from an Indigenous standpoint, right? Critiquing the colonial approaches of the natural sciences or the hard sciences to everything Indigenous, be it environmental stuff or biological sciences, it could be any field. But then I've got a group of students who are aligning themselves as well with research creation. And I'm thinking of two in particular, and I'll talk a little bit about what their work, I think, and then how these things kind of bump up against each other. And we are not able to anymore keep our two research groups apart. We are beginning to write grants and research in ways that are bringing them together, because that's what's happening on the ground. We're not forcing this. It's just we can't keep them apart. So I'll think of two students in general. And one of them works centrally in a project with me that will describe some of my work. So Kirsten Lindquist is a Korean Métis burlesque dancer. She's got a background in Indigenous governance and advertising. She's also a body worker. She's my co-producer of our sexy storytelling and cabaret show that's called Teepee Confessions, we have done shows across Canada. We've done them in the US, and we're now working on our first online show with Toronto Queer Film Fest that we will launch, I think, in February. And so that show, the graduate students that work with that are actually writing their dissertations about doing burlesque, right? And they're sort of bringing their humanities and literature theories and Native studies theories to combine with the way that they dance. And so the dancing is kind of looping back the way that they're dancing, the political, because we do very politicized burlesque. It's very anti-colonial, right? And so fascinating, but also really entertaining, very sexy, because it's a sexy storytelling show. So they're kind of both dancing, developing a dance troupe, these artistic kind of communities. We're developing a cooperative kind of a performance or theater co-op. So we're doing institution building and thinking about alternative ways of fundraising, but they're also writing dissertations out of this work. And then I've got another story, or another student, Tara Capo, who just finished her master's in the Faculty of Native Studies. I was one of the people on her committee. I think I co-advised her with Shailene Jobin, who does Indigenous governance, right? So it tells you how we're bringing things together. But Tara did a master's thesis on beadwork as theory. And what's really interesting, there's a lot of Indigenous beadworkers across Canada, the United States in particular, who are already thinking. I always say some of our greatest theorists, Indigenous theorists, are people in community, people that are working not only with their art forms or their environmental activism, but they're also expressing their approaches to thought through Indigenous languages. Even if they're not fluent thinkers, they're working, or fluent speakers, they're working with, say, Cree speakers or Dakota or Lakota speakers, and they're thinking what we do and the work that they do in relationship to the language. And so Tara brought Cree into her thesis. And what she did was she talked about the beadwork. I wish she was here. She's so brilliant. The beadwork, it's not only the beadworker that produces the beadwork, and I'm sure all artists kind of have this sense of things. The beads will do certain things that they want to do, and there's other things they don't want to do, right? And there are lessons to be learned by the beadworker about how to sort of live in better relation by following. It's kind of a co-constitutive thing between the beads and the artist, right? Who are producing the beadwork itself, and these practices of being in good relation with these so-called inanimate objects. Tara thinks about beads and beadwork and the different ways in which those are made animate in Cree. There's a very different way to think about beadwork and the beads and the process of beading in Cree than in English. And so this brings me to another point. When I look at the work of our grad students, they will take advantage of non-Indigenous frameworks and approaches like research creation, like new materialisms. But what they do is they put that into conversation with the language and approaches and worldviews in Indigenous language. And they say, okay, I can interpret what I'm doing for you in terms of research creation. I can avail myself of that language and those approaches. But there's another way to talk about this in Cree. And that's what I really love about what our students are doing. And so for me, the work that I'm doing is really about making space for them and helping get their work credentialized and recognized within the university. So the very ability to do a very involved, huge piece of beadwork and to write a thesis around that is something that takes multiple kinds of academic thinkers to help do that and credentialize that, right? And so that's kind of what we're working on, making more space to bring Indigenous thought into the university in ways that are kind of understood by the university, and get the resources for students to do this work and thought in conversation with people in their community. So that's maybe a good start.
Yeah. So that's great. And I think this might actually be a really good moment to also bring Ted onto the stage. And so one of the things that all of you have pointed to so far is the what I'm going to frame as a kind of excessive some practices that are excessive to discipline, that exceed disciplines. And Kim, you were talking about how the projects are bleeding into each other, and that on the ground, what's happening endogenously is that they're emerging as, you know, kind of companion projects, and that's not something that you're putting onto them, but genuinely what is there to respond to. And this reminds me again of something that you said at the beginning, Patrick, in terms of the promise and possibility of working across ways of knowing, and also working responsibly with the project, asking the project what it needs, and through this, how our practices become changed, right? And you know, this, and if I think about, you know, a question that has been front and center for many of us for a while now, which is, you know, what is the work of the university today, right? In a time of intersecting global and social and ecological crisis, or if we want to challenge the language of crisis, we could use urgency. Really, what is the work of the university, and what are we called upon to do together? And so in that regard, I'm thinking about the ways that each of you here have projects that exceed. So research creation is something that, you know, SSHRC has been central, right, on the national stage to advocate, had central in advocating for, allocating resources to, and, you know, and I've just heard each of you speak to the ways in which research creation is being, as opening spaces, being a lever in the university to kind of facilitate other ways of working. And so given that each of you work not only with SSHRC literacies, but also in projects that exceed SSHRC, you know, both NSERC and CIHR, I wonder if, you know, if you guys would like to say a little bit more about your experience navigating across the Tri-Council, and if Ted, if you'd like to speak to the importance of research creation within the SSHRC constellation of granting programs, but also your involvement in Tri-Council initiatives that welcome SSHRC perspectives. And I'm also interested in some of the difficulties that emerge when it comes to the legibility of research creation on interdisciplinary adjudication panels. So I guess the question really to all of you is both to the promises of research creation as something that exceeds SSHRC and crosses the Tri-Council, but also some of the limitations and some of the locations of friction in doing this kind of essentially advocacy work.
Who do you want to start? Maybe I should hear. Maybe I should hear first from you before I.
Yeah, well, Caitlin, Kim, Patrick, do you want to share any of your experiences?
I'll slide in first. Just yeah, I was really inspiring to hear about your students, Kim. And I feel very similar. I think this is really an epistemological challenge to the Academy. And I think sometimes it's about legibility, but it's also legibility meeting resistance. I think at the same time that, that one of my experiences working with colleagues, particularly in engineering, so one of my longtime collaborators is Dr. Steve Mann at the University of Toronto. And one of the things where there are cognate practices, of course, that engineers experiment and break things all the time. Engineers think through modeling and experimentation. It's taught me a lot. So Steve will often say that his method involves tinquery, which is his little coining of tinkering and inquiry, which seems very, very cognate. And I often do wonder why, because the research product of our engineering colleagues is intelligible. There's this sense that, anyway, I think it's a lot more radical than I'd initially thought. And I think there's a lot to learn from practices where there has been historically more freedom and more openness to engage in lab work, in radical experimentation, in innovation. The areas where people are involved in technology innovation, for example, desperately need humanists and artists. But it's also a place where research creation fits, I think, very well. But at the same time, I think that there are these moments that are very inspiring, often that come from students that are around just outside of what the Academy can really support. I see students all the time in situations where they have this incredible research creation project, and yet will also be writing the 250 words. Sort of, it's really an act of translation, that the knowledge has been produced through research creation, but also has to be tamed and put into recognizable forms. So I think we're really at this cusp moment, but I also think that we're really, really lucky here to have SSHRC support for this kind of work, and to be able to have these conversations.
Maybe I'll jump in there just to both respond to something Kim said, and also I think to echo the direction that you're going, Caitlin. One of the things when you were talking about the beadwork, and actually I had my friend and colleague Shelley Nero was teaching a group of students who are not artists, and she had invited in Sam Thomas, who's an Iroquois beadworker, done a lot of really significant research and beading. And the students themselves did a beadworking project and then needed to reflect on it. And so both when you were talking and in that context, and also as an artist, it strikes me that oftentimes in the arts and humanities, we think of sort of material practice as fundamentally about expression. And I mean, it certainly can be. But I think that, what we don't emphasize as much, and yet I think artists emphasize it all the time, is material experimentation and material making as engage with problem solving, and as you said, Kim, the production of language. And I think, if we look to sort of generalize, if we look to the sciences, we see all kinds of material experimentation in the pursuit of knowledge. But when we bring it into the arts, oftentimes we see it as being about expressing the culture, for example. And I mean, that's important, but I think it's a bit overly limited. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I wonder in where the individual versus communal is in that as well. I think a lot of, sure, and I don't want to speak on behalf of beadworkers, I'm not one, but knowing enough about it coming from a culture that does that, there is a way in which one can express oneself as an artist, right? A beadworker as an artist, as a creator. But the way I hear it talked about by beadworkers is about linking them with their ancestors, right? Linking them with the language, linking them with a broader community, building relations between themselves and beads and other bead workers. So it's not, it can be portrayed as an individualistic creative pursuit, but I think that is a very flat representation of what it actually probably is in the way that I observe Indigenous beadworkers work. Yeah.
And I would say that even in terms of just more broadly, when we think of, and I seem to be focusing on sort of art practice, but when we think about more broadly individual expression, fundamentally, in a kind of Western context, it's so readily then given to the idea of its value as a commodity and as an index of that individual maker. Whereas I think one of the benefits of research creation is, we're working as individuals, but ultimately we tend to need to work more collaboratively. And so we sort of undermine that ready assumption that the essential value of the artwork is in its, kind of monetary potential, which I realize most artists don't necessarily think of. But I think, I encounter people in the university today who still sort of will ask the question about sales and all that, horrors. I think it is important for artists to sell their work, but I don't think that system of value is the first and foremost one that's of interest, especially in a place of knowledge seeking and creation such as the university and beyond.
Maybe I'll jump in there if it's okay, Natalie. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I'll be speaking from the perspective of a funder. So let's be clear, there are certain limitations associated with that. But I know that that's been important to you, all of you, probably at some time or other. I wanted to first congratulate, though, all of the folks who are involved with the development of the exhibition, because I think this is very exciting and is a catalyst for this discussion. Stephen's involvement doesn't surprise me at all. Just one of his many talents, someone who I've come to know quite well over the past few years, and he's been involved in so many projects. So it's just really nice to see CIHR and Stephen involved at this level. So one of the things about research creation that I noted, and I have to say that, what I know about it, it really is thanks to you, Patrick, going back 20 years nearly when I was at Western. And I remember specifically the Art and Cold Cash project, and you explaining to me in great detail, where you were moving with this and why it needed to be supported and how we had to think differently about research and research creation. And I think in my time at SSHRC, which now spans nearly 10 years since before I was president, we have spent a lot of time thinking about developing and nurturing programming that supports research creation specifically. The one thing we did do, which I think was definitely the right move, was to take this from sort of a niche funding area and apply it to the entire array of SSHRC programming. So now you can apply for pretty much any program within SSHRC and simply indicate that you're applying as part of a research creation template or format and of course, or perspective, and that will trigger a separate review process. We think folks have been successful because we know that the success rates actually for these projects has been about the same as it is for others. And that's very encouraging. So somehow we've managed, but I'm not saying there aren't challenges. Certainly as Natalie had sort of suggested, forming review committees, very hard, to try and get people who have the right kind of frame in order to assess some pretty disparate projects. And as you mentioned, the interdisciplinarity that is pretty much inherent in research creation perspective is often a challenge for peer review committees to manage. But it's exciting, it's a really exciting area for us. It's something we really want to understand. Certainly that and approaches to Indigenous research. And it was just great to hear from Kim in terms of what you're doing in that program. But we've made serious efforts to connect better and more often with Indigenous communities and Indigenous scholars in order to improve our offering and to make sure that we're attentive to what are the particular needs of that community in terms of funding. The question of interdisciplinarity, which I think is fundamental also in our discussions around the emerging and evolving nature of Indigenous research, is one that we're starting to deal with in a couple of different ways. Aside from just trying to be open, as we formulate peer review committees and we deal with these projects, we've created a couple of mechanisms that I think will be very helpful to you and to colleagues. One we call the tri-agency institutional interdisciplinary peer review mechanism. We call it TallBear which kind of takes me back, some of the kids' stories. Wasn't Arthur the aardvark? Was he an aardvark or was he a tapir? I can't remember. But the tapir approach is designed to allow for people to apply for funding and to indicate, at the point of application, that their project fundamentally crosses the mandates of the 3 councils, or 2 councils at least. That in turn signals a different kind of review. We have a different peer review committee. It relies on expertise from 2 or 3 councils as needed. You can apply to the program you would normally apply to. You can apply to Insight, for example, or Discovery if you're at NSERC, or you can apply for an operating grant at CIHR. We had about 100 applications last year. Some of them just incredibly diverse, in terms of what people are trying to do. So I think that's going to open a door to different kinds of things we haven't seen. And the last thing I wanted to point out, which has had great, fantastic implications for some of the work we've funded in Indigenous research also, is our New Frontiers in Research Fund. And that is, and has been created across the 3 councils. It is specifically designed to attract proposals that are out of the box, in many cases, way out of the box. And I think could be particularly relevant to a research creation approach, and we've had some great examples I can tell you about in terms of application. But proposals, they must be interdisciplinary. They need to be beyond what anyone would send to SSHRC or NSERC or CIHR, and they can be funded at different levels. I think we started about 250,000. For 2-year projects, but they're supposed to be risky. There's supposed to be things that can't otherwise be funded by the councils. We have had a particularly high rate of applications from Indigenous scholars, including community-based work, and a particularly high success rate for those in this program. And I think that speaks in part to the nature of the program itself, which is attracting proposals that weren't necessarily finding a home in the councils. And I think for research creation, that could work as well. And I remember one, I want to tell you, was an application I saw that as soon as I saw the list of disciplines, I thought, I can't imagine how this is going to work. It was religion, architecture, art, and engineering. And I thought, what on earth could this be about? And how could you possibly combine these different approaches in a project? And I can't remember now the specific objective, but then that was just 1 week before the fire at the Notre Dame Cathedral, when you had artists, architects, engineers, and religious studies experts all trying to figure out, how they were going to rebuild and recreate the damaged portion of the church. So this is what this program is for. So I think I'll stop there. I mean, if there are other challenges, you want to certainly make me aware of, or things we should be doing, or things we should be looking at, it's precisely through these kind of dialogues that, we get our best ideas in terms of the kind of things we need to do to bring our programs to make them more relevant to what you need, right across the board.
I think I would love to come back to that, and I see also that there's a question in the Q&A related to this. But first, quick note to Kim: Amanda Almond is beating right now as she's listening, and she wants you to know. And also, there is a request for you to restate the name of the student you mentioned who did their thesis in beadwork.
Oh, Tara, T-A-R-A, Cappo, K-A-P-P-O.
Great, thank you. So there's so many things I want to pick up on, and so many I'm sure you do as well. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I've got a lag here. I just wanted to follow up just quickly on Ted, because I'm very grateful for that program. So I currently hold one of the small New Frontiers grants with PI Lindsay Morecambe of Queen's University. And it really does speak to sort of the power of research creation. So our project is on virtual reality co-creation between Indigenous and settler artists. And it really is about making together and reconciliation through, or the potential, so that's the risk, right? how do you create these moments and hold the space to have something happen? So it's emergent and it's designed in particular ways. We're using sort of distributed sort of co-creation through open brush, multi-brush, and working together inside these networked environments, and to try something new in order to meet each other. And so far, it's been an incredible program.
That's great. I'm glad to hear it. I mean, it's when I review the list of topics and the things people are working on, it's utterly fascinating. I feel very happy, you know, at the fact that we were able to design this thing, implement it, and have people so actively using it, having access to it.
Mm-hmm. At this point, I would love to actually bring Geneviève onto the stage. Hey, well, welcome, Geneviève. So Geneviève, I want to kind of pull you in at this point before we go too far down other directions as a public health expert located at McMaster University. And there are two things that I'm particularly interested in hearing from you. And on the one hand, I'm genuinely curious about your read of the exhibition from a public health perspective. But also, given your previous work on large scale and transdisciplinary projects, I wonder if you can join the conversation at this point where we're thinking about the importance of synergistic research across the disciplines in ways that kind of exceed even the kind of interdisciplinary nodes of the Tri-Council. I know that research creation isn't your expertise, but I know that you have worked on and consider interdisciplinarity and collaborative projects as really kind of crucial to the kind of work that we do in the university. So I'd like to invite you to share your perspectives.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I'm speaking to all of you from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. I'm actually more of a scientist than a public health expert. I'm also a light-skinned woman with dark curly hair. And I think it's really, for me, coming, as Natalie was mentioning, I'm coming into this conversation with brand new eyes and brand new ears. Like, research creation is not my area of expertise. I'm an immunologist. I'm also working as a funder with the Canadian Institute for Health Research in the strategic space of infection and immunity. And that's really with kind of those eyes that I came in and I visited this exhibitions, and then I started learning about this whole process of research creations and how it worked. And I must say that it spoke to me at several levels. And then I jotted down some notes, but I think in terms of efficiency of time, I'm just going to try to cover some of the things that really inspired me through the conversation of today, but through the exhibitions that I visited as well. So I think in terms of thinking through some of those global issues, like we've been very much involved in the COVID-19 response, but before of that, I was working on the HIV and AIDS research, and then I've been involved around all of those different aspects, and then being myself a scientist, I've always seen sort of the science, and then especially now with the COVID-19 as sort of the center of some of those response and kind of pushing some of that innovation forward. But the thing with the process of science in itself and the way it creates its own knowledge within that cultural environment and so on and so forth, it's bring its own bias as well in terms of where we're going. So I think when I was looking at this exhibition, it really forced me to decenter myself from that evidence piece and then think of that true dialogue, that how the research creation process, how art could be that vehicle to really sort of bring those different perspectives. Because when we think of all of what's needed to address the complexity of a pandemic response, I mean, we're like the exhibitions is focused on vaccines, but they're everything around sort of the health inequity aspects that were magnified during COVID-19, like all of the dialogues about vaccine confidence, the fact that we still have 25% of our populations in Canada that does not get vaccinated. There's a huge issue around global access that sort of like are very entrenched in those issues around global governance, about nationalistic approach, and all of the institutions that exist already, all of the systems that needs to be rethink through a very creative process, as like all of us scholars have to have to approach and really use that creative energy to be able to rethink all of those different systems and then really find the way of transforming that to evolve our own society. So when I was like visiting that exhibition, I mean, this whole idea of interdisciplinarity and how art was at the center of this really was bringing that to the forefront of that. And then I think it goes back to what Patrick and Caitlin, you were talking about as you were talking about your different piece, how it could be, it is a vehicle for true dialogue as well. Because solving those issues, even if you are at the global level, or if you're at the societal level, or the individual level, it all relates to human relationships and trust, and the way that people can enter into a true dialogue from their different perspectives. So even if you're a scientist and you're trying to talk about your evidence, you have to consider where the other person is coming from in terms of how they're affected through that. When I was visiting your piece, Patrick, with the disimmunization, it was really an evocation to the fear and how like pandemic response can just bring intrinsically fear to people, and how you get lost into all of these dialogues that comes from the news. And then it's hard to understand. The process of science is messy when you try to create and have those dialogues, that those dialogues were on the public place. It's very messy to understand that. So just having this piece of art that kind of brings people to a different perspective, understand how other perspectives are coming into that. I mean, I thought for me was like very much of an evocation of how art can be displaced for true dialogue, but for also like changing perspective. I thought also it was very interesting, the shadow box one, which forces to rethink people's own responsibility into that and how your behavior affects other people as well. And it's sort of really bringing that perspective into light, that it's not just about me, it's also about the community, but how do I understand that? And then I really enjoyed also sort of the photography that we're coming with that, talking about the stigma. For me, it was really an invocation of the stigma piece, like seeing the people with the picture and the shadow box of them. And it's also such an important dimension of all of that global piece, of the global response, because it's so intrinsic in how people construct their identity, think of what's happening to them, that it's none of these pieces can be ignored as a way that we solve those issues. And then I thought like really having this opportunity to bring all of these different brains together, coming from all of these different perspectives, was really that opportunity for this true dialogue, where it really leads to creation of things that we wouldn't see otherwise, because we all have these silos of our own disciplines. And then that's why I also, as a funder, we're working so hard. And then I'm going to echo what Ted was talking about in terms of all of the challenge of really fostering true interdisciplinarity. I mean, at Sritharan, it's also something that we talk about so much in terms of how do we bring people together to be able to do that, but it remains with a lot of mechanistical issues around that, to really bring people to understand each other, trust each other, and be able to have that true dialogues, and it takes time, and it's all things that we need to acknowledge in the world that we are, that goes so fast, and we really need to think of how we can foster that. And so I think it's kind of that piece where like I was very inspired by that process, thinking how it's a way of true creation that we can foster and then really bring forward in terms of changing our perceptions altogether.
Yeah, I love where you bring this to as well, in terms of the problem with metrics, right? And the incredibly variable metric modalities that that each different system or discipline or funding body not only values but actually even recognizes, right? And so that kind of translation work, and the importance of that translation work, and that latitude, and Ted, I don't remember what words you used, but you kind of described the kind of the desire to create like more openness within the different granting programs in order to kind of allow for those spaces to be supported. And Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say something about that. We've done some analysis now of where interdisciplinary, just for lack of a better word, but where interdisciplinary is occurring within the New Frontiers program, for example, because it is explicitly required of applicants, and we were able to monitor precisely who was involved in what types of projects. So we did some analysis on this using a methodology that allowed us to map precisely where the disciplines were for projects. Interestingly, and a bit disappointingly, most of the interdisciplinarity was pretty close interdisciplinarity. So it was, sociology, political science, psychology, maybe law, right? But there was a band, and I think the number was about 10 or 15%, where the interdisciplinarity within these projects was much more diffuse, which went, if you think about a core of interdisciplinarity and then expanding out, which would mean linking in disciplines that were further away from your own, like I was saying, religious studies, engineering, they were about 10 or 15%. So we're taking the learnings from that to think about how we might encourage more of that type of further out interdisciplinarity that really taps into some interesting things. And again, that's for research creation. These are the kinds of spaces where it really plays. And I think, I'm hearing that again today in spades. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And then what can we learn from that for our regular programming? How can we incorporate that, into the TallBear programming that we're beginning to develop, et cetera?
And if I want to add here, Natalie, just something from our own experience as well. I mean, the whole idea of interdisciplinarity also needs to come from the whole ecosystem in itself, right? Because I think it echoes what Ted was saying in terms of there's few people that actually practice that in their own research with even having the eyes of going to get the collaborations at all different levels. So there's a responsibility that is shared across all of the different levels, from the researchers to the funders to everyone else that play into that whole ecosystem as well, in terms of really trying to think outside of the box to how you can approach the different disciplines.
Yes, thank you so much, Geneviève and Ted. Before Geneviève, you were speaking, I was actually thinking about conversations we had at the beginning of this project around success. And I remember that, in fact, it was one of the policy people, there was a lot of frustration, I will say, and because we were policy people, we were artists, we were, vaccine researchers. And I remember one of the policy people saying, that the kinds of things that, for example, some of the artists were talking about as sort of objectives or what they could envision would look like success seemed antithetical almost to what, this particular person would have wanted to see to come out of a project like this. And so it really struck me that, oftentimes, say in the art world, we have a sort of limited idea of success, and we wouldn't want to talk about, as Natalie said, sort of metrics that are about a kind of quantitative measure, except maybe how many people came to the show. But I think until we can have those conversations and and actually observe the kind of thing you said, Geneviève, about the value of a kind of open-ended kind of dialogical experience in a realm such as science, or perhaps versus the value of actually trying to measure in some generative way how people's ideas might have been changed from an artwork, from an experience of an artwork. Until we can have those conversations, I think there are certain limits on interdisciplinarity.
Caitlin, Kim, do you want to jump in on this?
Well, I was just thinking this might have nothing to do with what Patrick was just saying, but I think some of these conversations are easier. Like when I think about there's a Métis botanist that worked with us with 2 Métis graphic artists, and then a non-Indigenous queer identified population geneticists, they all worked together on our SING logo, our summer internship for Indigenous peoples and genomics, where they looked at the mapping of the 4 medicines of cedar, sweetgrass, tobacco, and sage, and kind of played with the assay and made it into a really cool logo. And there's a story behind that. I was thinking about that. For us, the outcomes in the work that we're doing the ultimate outcome is the survival of an Indigenous people as a people. That is the ultimate outcome. All of these projects can help us get to that point, right? In fact, all of them are necessary. So, I think those internal conversations for us are easy. It's when we are required, like I cannot stand the pull down menus from SSHRC. Native studies isn't even there. I'm always like, am I doing anthropology? Am I doing this? Am I doing I hate having to be interpreted by that because, I don't care about those disciplinary boundaries. We draw on them if they facilitate a good approach to solving a problem, but I could care less about gatekeeping any of these disciplines, right? They're all equally colonial. They're all have been equally anti-Indigenous. Science is no worse than humanities disciplines. So anyway, yeah, that was interesting to me to think about why our outcomes are not difficult, although they become difficult when we have to appeal to our particular disciplinary gatekeepers through which the hoops we're jumping through as Indigenous academics. That's true. I'm sorry, I was talking so quick.
The good news on the drop down is, of course, your application is going to get where it needs to go regardless. But this is a perfect example of multiple federal agencies having to agree on definitions before implementing. So those research categories are actually determined and held by Statistics Canada. And we have to negotiate with them, NSERC, CIHR, and everybody to add them. The really good news is they're all going to be added, even if not everyone finds them relevant or useful. Thank you. Point taken.
Caitlin, do I see you jumping in or? Okay.
Oh.
No, go ahead, Caitlin.
Okay, sorry, there's lag here. I'll just share the screen quickly because it's, oh, hang on. So I'm always grateful when the result of sort of a research creation project that is across disciplines results in something that is a key deliverable, even if it might not be the most important. So this is a still from, this is part of a lock-in amplifier project that was largely SSHRC funded across NSERC, again with my collaborator, Dr. Steve Mann. And there's my doctoral student, Alison, Humphrey, and I, and we're in an alleyway in Toronto playing, a theater with part of the lock-in amplifier. But as a consequence of a lot of this play, and really the ideas that came out of that early grant were sort of pivoted to Canada Foundation for Innovation grant for the Immersive Storytelling Lab, largely oriented toward immersive storytelling. But one of the things that comes out of it that was not one of the things that we'd planned is, we currently, one of our deliverables will be the most advanced lock-in amplifier in the world. And that's part of technology development that occurs at the intersection of thinking about engineering, but also this kind of play, this imaginative space. And so I'm always super grateful when something like that happens because the funding agency can see that. But that's just this tiny bit of actually the foundation that went into creating the conditions of possibility for that kind of tangible success for particular interlocutors to the project. And I say that in part like I'm laughing about it, but it's also kind of scary sometimes not to end up with deliverables that make sense to funders across the board. So both of those things. I feel very, very committed. I think that amazing outcomes are always possible, but don't always make it within one particular grant. And it might be seen in the next grant. And so how do we think about success?
So you might have noticed that, so I want to acknowledge we have about 7 minutes left to our formally allocated time. And you might have noticed that I haven't been coming in with kind of questions. from the audience. Primarily that's because the conversation has organically included responses to and answers to the questions that have been coming in, except that there's this one that I think in some ways we've touched on, but also I certainly want to say something about, so I'll share it with the room. The question is framed like this: does anyone worry that the framing of research creation as new can be problematic? There are many examples of research creation type activities throughout history and across cultures. Perhaps framing this as new dismisses this history. And I wanted to kind of put a little spotlight on that question for two reasons. One, it puts a fine point on like for the decision I made when I wrote my book on research creation to really take the university as site, as the kind of the foundation for the conversation. And so I think this question asks us to differentiate between research creation as a funding category, developed in Quebec and then across the country, that really is a way of intervening into given disciplinary norms within university spaces. So that kind of intervention, and then the kinds of outputs and interdisciplinary and collaborative approaches that cross the so-called practice theory lines that we're all describing. And so in this regard, I want to let everyone know that RACAR, which is the art history journal from the Canadian Art History Association, UAC, has a fall 2023 issue coming out called The Sources of Research Creation, Historical and Multicultural Perspectives, that's edited by Cynthia Hammond and Isabelle Pichet. And so I do want to, for those of you in the audience who are interested in this question, to flag that fall 2023 issue of RACAR, but also to pose the question to all of you and your thoughts on this.
Well, that's a really great, thank you, great intro to this question, Natalie. And in fact, when I had made the comment about sort of material regarding knowledge, I had actually written down new knowledge and then crossed out the word new, thinking, well, it's not always about new knowledges, it's sometimes recovered knowledges. And, I'll just say something about, even if we want to think of a Western context of art in the academy, certainly, I mean, that evolved out of a world in which there was all kinds of interdisciplinarity that then gave way to, the kind of disciplinary specificity of the artist and art history, et cetera, et cetera. So some of this is actually about looking back to ways in which, there was a lot more sort of interdisciplinarity or a lot more cross-pollination among disciplines and among also citizens or, experts and average citizens, as it were. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll just say again, I think for a lot of Indigenous thinkers in the academy, it's a language that they can access to help frame for the academy what they're doing, right? And for funders what they're doing. But obviously they could talk about the way that these approaches in their own languages, and I mean, also in English, but in community kind of approaches, right? So, but it is helpful to have a kind of, I mean, research creation languages and theories are incisive, right? It's like the way that I use anthropology, it's ethnographic approaches have been very valuable for me as an Indigenous person, right? Even though I don't want to gatekeep what is anthropology, I'm certainly happy to do ethnographic field observations and take some of their techniques and perform them, which I was going to say earlier too, when I talk about performance, it's not only performance on a stage, but performance as an act of doing, right? And so, I often perform being an anthropologist in a way where I'm legitimately trying to do robust ethnographic observations, mostly of white people, mostly scientists, but also there's a performance aspect to it. It's not only the white gaze that gets to perform their observations of us, right? There's something inherently critical in saying, oh, no, I'm going to be the observer of you, right? So playing a lot with what does performance mean?
Yeah. I love that, and it's a perfect segue into maybe a way of concluding a panel that clearly could go on in many different and robust directions. But I see, the last part of a question that a colleague of mine who I collaborate with here at the University of Alberta, Sritharan Mkrtich, the last part of his question that I think is visible to everybody, where he says, I'm thinking about the possibilities that lie in research creation's inescapable attention to form, right? Whether forms of knowledge, communication, technique, practice, exchange, wealth, law, etc. And then the TRC, it seems to be, calls for radical transformation of all forms through which national life now unfolds in relation to the poetics and politics of treaties. And I think ending, while that in itself could start us on a whole other panel discussion for another hour and a half, I want to close this on this question of form, and that is, what you are bringing into the room when you talk about performance. Right, and the different ways in which the artistic literacy, certainly that I draw on, pay attention to institutional critique, performance art intervention, right, dialogic aesthetics. These are practices that use the aesthetic sensorium, attention to what different forms afford, what they render possible, and what they delimit. And that asks us to bring this attention to all of the spaces we work in and inhabit, right? Of course, we didn't do anything really interesting with this. This is a straightforward webinar. It is a kind of, it's a proscenium logic form that allows certain conversations to happen. And I'm really grateful for this conversation and what it's made possible. But what it hasn't made possible is robust conversation with the 71, now 68 people sitting in your rooms, wherever you are. So I want to say that it is 11:30. I thank you all for your time. The transcript will be made available, and I look forward to further conversations in other Zoom rooms or halls or corners post-COVID. And thank you again, Carol and Elise and Erin and Diane, for your work. And don't forget to join us for the next panel, which is December 9th. And if you go to immunations.com, you will see the button to register.
Thank you, Natalie. Great to see everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you all. That was great.
Thank you, Natalie.